Imagine a night, air thick as ink, a tense howl of sirens, the rumble of enemy engines trembling above the ground as if a swarm of steel predators cuts through the darkness. The pilots are certain that below them lies Moscow. They see the familiar outlines of the Kremlin. They recognize the slow ribbon of the Moscow River, the lights of the bridges, the straight lines of the streets. It seems to them that the city stands still, waiting for the strike. And then the bombs fall. One, another, more. Flashes, thunder, bursts of fire slice through the night, but soon something unbelievable becomes clear. The bombs fall into emptiness. They explode among forests, on open fields, on land where there is no Kremlin, no buildings, no people. The pilots are attacking a city that does not exist, a phantom city, created by human hands in the darkest days of war. This is not a legend, not a story, not a film. This is reality, a reality that almost no one knows. Who created this phantom? Who dared to build an entire double of the capital? How did they manage to deceive trained war pilots? And why this story remained hidden from the world for decades? Are you ready to discover what has long been kept secret, concealed at the edge of the real Moscow? By the autumn of 1941, the country stood on the brink of disappearance. The enemy advanced step by step toward the capital, reclaiming towns, cutting railway lines, leaving behind ash and smoldering ruins. It seemed that time itself held its breath as if waiting to see whether Moscow would endure. Fear hung in the air. It showed in every glance, in every passerby stare, in every whisper behind closed doors. People understood that a decisive moment was approaching, and that the outcome of the coming days would determine not only the existence of the capital, but the fate of the whole nation. Enemy pilots carried out raids almost every night, and each time residents rose to the alarm, descended to basements, held children to their chests, praying that another dawn would once more light their streets. The command understood perfectly that if the heart of the state fell, the moral blow would be worse than any weapon. The loss of Moscow would mean not merely a military defeat, it would shatter the hope of the people. That is why the leadership was forced to seek solutions that in peacetime would have seemed absurd. In war, the boundary between the real and the impossible blurs, and an idea that would have provoked laughter in peace suddenly becomes the only chance. In those hard days, sealed orders began to arrive at the offices of military engineers, architects, lighting specialists, set designers, people who usually built theatrical stages. They were not told much. They were not given details. Yet each of them understood that the price of error was enormous. The decision had to be swift, bold, and daring. The city prepared for defense barricades. Rows anti-tank defenses were installed. Trenches were dug, but it was not enough. The enemy saw the capital from the air, and it was from above that he had to be deceived. In government rooms where maps lay flat on tables, where aerial route charts hung on walls, where lights stayed on through the night, the incredible was discussed. If it was impossible to hide Moscow, then they would show the enemy another Moscow. Not the real one, but the one he expected to see and accept as the target. The idea was almost fantastical. Create an illusion, create a mirrored city, create a vast stage in the open air. It took immense composure to decide on this, but those making the decisions had no choice. Each day brought new alarming reports. Enemy forces drew ever closer. Ruined towns were grim reminders of what could happen to Moscow. No one could say no. No one doubted. Everyone understood that the moment had come when the future depended on a person's ability to deceive the enemy, gaze, make him believe a false reality so convincingly that he would send his bombs where they would claim no lives. This was a struggle not only of arms, but of ideas, imagination, and cunning, and this battle was waged not only on the ground, but in the minds of those who looked at the city from the heights of the sky. The idea didn't come at once. It was born in the quiet after yet another alarming briefing, when people in their offices could no longer rely on habitual patterns of thought, when familiar solutions seemed insufficient. Then, one of the senior engineers, a man with a theatrical habit of thinking in terms of space and light, spoke aloud a thought that at first sounded insane, but gradually took shape and strength. He proposed to deceive not slightly, but completely, to create for the enemy what he expected to see, but not what actually existed, not a city, but its shadow, not buildings but silhouettes, not a square but imaginary streets. They peered into the maps that lay on the tables and understood that from above you see only outlines, lines, and light, and that could be played like an artist. This man gathered around himself not only soldiers and engineers, but also set designers, painters, lighting technicians, construction crews, people who knew how to make a stage truth convincing, and in this strange coalition of theater and technology, a strategy was born that required not weapons, but cunning, not military calculation, but an aesthetic sense. It was decided to act quickly and secretly, because delay would mean risk for the capital. In closed meetings, they discussed materials that could be used: light wooden frames, canvases imitating roofs, mirrored surfaces to mimic rivers, powerful projectors to imitate lights, and moving mechanisms to create the impression of transport. But the main aim was not to make an exact copy. It was to achieve the necessary visual effect from the prescribed altitude. All calculations were made on the basis of how a pilot perceives a city at night, how the eyes read contrast and light, how the impression of volume is created on the ground. The specialists argued at length, and sometimes heatedly. One officer demanded maximal plausibility, another leaned toward skepticism. In the end, the idea of theatrical truth won, the kind that works at first glance. That very night, the first sketches appeared on the tables, done in pencil and ink. They resembled stage plans but contained the notes of frontline maps. A few days later, trial setups began in field conditions. Workers who before the war had made opera scenery suddenly found themselves building outdoors. Their hands knew how to create illusion with minimal means. The project drew in people experienced in pyrotechnics to manage light effects. Engineers calculated reflections and angles of incidents. Artists studied shadows. Night hours became an ally when emptiness worked in their favor. No one spoke of this aloud beyond the offices. Secrecy was almost a religion. People signed non-disclosure agreements and worked through nights, often under fire, but they saw in it not only an order, but a chance to save thousands of lives. When the first prototype of the stage was completed, tests showed that from the required flight altitude, the imitation was perceived as a real target, and at that moment, those who had been at the origin of the idea realized the risk had been justified. But the hardest part still lay ahead: convincing the high command to sign off on the project. When the signatures were affixed and the decisions made, preparations began for the operation that later saved the city, not by the force of artillery, but by the power of human inventiveness and theatrical craftsmanship. The chosen site for the camouflage proved mystically convenient. A flat steppe near Mytishchi, fields and scattered woods hid the work. The road to the site was guarded more strictly than many military depots. Materials were delivered at night. Convoys under the cover of darkness brought wooden beams, tarpaulins, mirrored sheets, and lamps. Workers arrived in twos and threes like shadows with their faces wrapped in scarves. Village elders and landowners received mute instructions not to ask questions. Locals saw only occasional flashes of light and heard the hammering, but did not know of the plan taking shape in their fields. The authorities demanded strict silence, and secrecy became the new norm. Security measures were clever and paradoxical. To hide the truth from accidental eyes, builders hid frames under nets. Artificial streets were laid out exactly along directions matching the enemy's aeronautical charts. Theater architects and engineers calculated perspective, so silhouettes would look plausible from an altered aerial view. Assemblers made facades light so they could be erected quickly and dismantled just as fast if needed. Designs were created based on which details would be visible from altitude and which would not. Long strips of fabric that shimmered in the light were used for streets to mimic rivers. Metal structures remotely resembling arches were installed where bridges would be. A few clever solutions strengthened the illusion. For example, along the supposed streets, small clusters of lights were placed to flicker at different rates to mimic moving cars. For the tram effect, a light source moved along rails. Though the rails were only guides, everything worked so the pilot's brain would read what it saw as real, so that in the rapid flyover there would be no time for doubt. The critical part of the project lay with the lighting operators, whose task was almost magical. They had to set beam direction, intensity, and tint to create the illusion of a residential layer and focus the skyward gaze where there was not a single person, Coordination between units was as finely tuned as a theater before opening night. Everyone knew their pauses, signals, and codes. Rehearsals were held at night, sometimes in rain, sometimes under the threat of aerial observation to ensure the effect held in any conditions. One night when tests went especially well, the senior engineer lit a cigarette and, looking at the finished stage, quietly said, "It was the most expensive and strangest spectacle he had ever seen." People worked not for glory. They knew their names would be buried in archive folders forever, but to save the city, for the thousands of unborn future stories. And when at last the artificial silhouette of the capital was ready, the team felt both exhaustion and a strange pride, as if they had done something forbidden but necessary, something that in peacetime would have been called madness, and in war had become the last hope. The next phase was devoted to details, to those tricks of vision and light that distinguish a real city from its deceptive shadow. The workers understood that from an airplane cockpit, one does not see bricks and windows, but contours and reflections. So every element was designed not to withstand close inspection, but to create the correct effect from above, simple solutions becoming brilliant instruments of deception. To imitate the Kremlin, they used lightweight frames and fabrics coated to resemble stone under light. The towers were drawn with deep dark shading and illuminated, so their silhouette from the air matched the familiar outline. To create the river, they used long strips of foil and shiny cloth that glimmered in a slight breeze, producing the illusion of a water surface. The bridges were assembled from light metal frames and placed on raised ground, so their shadows and reflections provided the visual marker a pilot would search for in the dark. But the true magic lay in the control of light, in the sequence of lamps and spotlights switched on and off according to a schedule to create the effect of moving traffic and life. Along the imitated streets, they installed rows of small lights flickering at different rates, sometimes beginning to move like the headlights of a car, sometimes pausing as if the engine had stalled, while disguised light sources moving along guides created the smooth line of a tram. The effect was enhanced by mirrored surfaces and reflective screens directing beams exactly where they were expected. Lighting artists precisely calculated the angle and intensity so that shadows fell as they would in a real city. For the night staging, they used smoke and a light veil of steam to soften contours and add depth to the scene, and sometimes sound devices played distant horns, barking dogs, or occasional footsteps as if life truly continued there. The goal was not to fool a nearby witness completely, but to catch the pilot's eye for a fraction of a second, to ensure that during the flyover there would be no time for doubt. Assemblers worked quickly, structures were set up and taken down as needed, materials were chosen for their combination of lightness and believability. Every detail was tested from the ground and from the air. Test flights revealed weaknesses, and they were corrected immediately. The effect was tuned like a complex musical instrument. And when the night of the first full rehearsal arrived, when the lights ignited and reflections began to shimmer, the hearts of those watching from below beat wildly, because it seemed that a true miracle was possible, that a simple play of light and shadow could protect an entire city. When the night of the first real test came, the tension was almost tangible. The sky seemed endlessly high, black and cold. The air trembled with expectation. The people on the ground stood in silence. No one spoke a word. Everyone knew that this night would decide not only the fate of their work, but the fate of the capital itself, over which the shadow of an approaching disaster hung. In the distance, a long humming sound appeared, a sound that had become familiar over the months of war. It meant the approach of enemy aircraft. At first it was faint, like the echo of a distant storm. Then it grew louder, heavier, closer, as if the sky itself began to vibrate. At that moment, the lighting operators took their positions. Every spotlight, every lamp, every reflector had been prepared in advance. They knew their signals, their moments, their exact seconds, and one by one, they began to light the city as if it were waking from darkness. The imitated streets lit up in even lines of light. The shining surface of the river flickered with quiet silver reflections. The silhouettes of towers and roofs emerged from the darkness in soft shadows. The tram lights began their fragile journey along invisible guides. Several points of light on the horizon moved forward as if cars were driving along streets. Everything happened quietly, smoothly, restrained, as if the night itself feared to disturb this illusion. And then the enemy pilots saw the picture they expected. The city below them appeared alive. They recognized familiar landmarks. They recognized the silhouettes they had studied on maps. They saw what they wanted to see. The crews prepared to drop bombs, and at that moment, everyone on the ground held their breath. No one moved. No one tried to guess the outcome. They simply listened to the roar of the sky and waited for the enemy's decision. And then came the whistle of falling bombs, first one, then another, then a whole sequence. The earth shook, flashes blinded the darkness, pillars of fire rose above the forest, above the empty land where there were no houses, no streets, no people. The explosions repeated like heartbeats, heavy and muffled, but in this thunder there was salvation. In the real Moscow that night, not a single bomb fell. Every bomb was lost in emptiness. The enemy pilots returned to their base convinced that the strike had been precise, that the target had been destroyed. They reported on damage, on fire, on the destruction of strategic sites. They never imagined that below them was not a city, but a reflection created by human mind and human hands. On the ground, in the dark, people watched the distant flashes and remained silent because they understood that they had just witnessed something incredible. A victory, not by force of weapons, but by the power of illusion, cleverness, art, precision, and courage, strong enough to protect the heart of a nation. It was proof that in the hardest moments, a person is capable of decisions that cannot be called simple or easily understood, but which save lives. After the first successful deception, the enemy did not immediately understand what had happened. The pilot's report sounded confident. They described bright flashes on the ground, thick smoke and fire. They reported that the target had been hit, and this created the illusion of success. But soon intelligence discovered a strange inconsistency. The city the pilot spoke of continued to live. Its streets were still lit, stations were operating, people went to work. There were no ruins, no fires, none of the chaos that inevitably follows a massive strike. The enemy command was confused. Some insisted that Moscow had hidden the consequences of the bombing. Others claimed that the pilots had made a navigational error and attacked the wrong sector. Still others suggested that the Russians had found a way to mask destruction and rebuild damaged buildings incredibly quickly. Discussions and arguments began between field headquarters. Reports were rewritten. New maps appeared on the walls. But not a single analyst could imagine that a few dozen kilometers from the capital stood an artificial stage created solely to take the blow. Enemy engineers tried to recalculate the approach angles of the aircraft, change trajectories, retarget the groups, but each time encountered the same paradox. The pilots saw the city, the landmarks matched, the nightlights confirmed the layout of the streets, and each time the bombs fell where no one lived. Trust between pilots and command began to waver. The pilots claimed they had seen the target. The command insisted the target had not been hit, and neither side understood that the reason was neither error nor some new weapon, but the mastery of camouflage, something they could not even imagine. Some reports began to contain strange lines. Pilots complained that the ground seemed to shift, that familiar landmarks seemed to drift in the darkness. One pilot said it felt as if the city itself had become a ghost slipping away from their sights. These words were not taken seriously, but they carried a truth no one was ready to name. A few officers began to suspect that the Russians were using a form of optical deception, but the idea seemed too bold, too incredible, too close to art rather than war. Enemy maps were checked again and again. They calculated by stars, compared aerial photographs. But the camouflage was built not only with logic, but with perception. It was calculated for the human eye in night flight conditions. It worked in the pilot's mind as much as on the ground. And if something deceives the eye, a person will believe what he sees, even if what he sees is a lie. So the illusion continued to work night after night, raid after raid, and each such night was time won, a life saved, hope preserved. Moscow survived not only because of weapons, but because of the art of deceiving those who came with sky and fire. This story was destined for silence from the very beginning. Everyone who took part in building the Phantom City signed documents forbidding them to say even a word about their work. Even many years after the war, the people who had created the life-saving illusion with their own hands had no right to speak of it to family, friends, or neighbors. Secrecy spread like fog and deepened the shadows around this story. The workers returned home simply tired, but could not explain the source of their exhaustion. Engineers wrote calculations in notebooks that were later destroyed. Blueprints disappeared into safes that might remain closed for years. Their traces dissolved in archives where the answer to the question lay in a folder without a label. Those who commanded the operation understood that the value of this secret lay not only in military cunning, but in psychological defense. If the enemy learned that they had bombed emptiness, they would change their approach, strategies, and routes, and then the capital would no longer be protected by illusion. So silence became an extension of the defense, invisible but just as important as fortress walls. Years passed, the war ended, cities were rebuilt. People tried to forget the fear of night sirens, but those who remembered the phantom city continued to keep quiet, as if they were still standing under the roar of aircraft, as if the shadow of those nights had never left them. Many went to their graves without ever telling what they had done. Their names were never spoken at parades. They were not written about in newspapers. Their awards were modest or non-existent. Yet their work lived every time someone looked at a map of Moscow and saw that it still stood, that its streets had not been torn apart in that terrible autumn. Only many years later did researchers begin to find scattered mentions, short notes in the margins of reports, vague memories of old builders, photographs showing strange structures in the middle of a field, documents that had lain for decades in sealed archives. At first, it looked like a legend, like a rumor, like a myth. But over time, the details began to form a coherent picture, one of audacity, craftsmanship, and almost theatrical power of the human imagination. The revealing of this secret was like a sunken city rising in the memory of history. Suddenly it became clear that the salvation of Moscow had been not only the result of military tactics, but also the result of the art of seeing differently, of thinking beyond familiar boundaries, of using light, shadow, and perception itself as a weapon. Today we can speak of it openly, but there is still something quiet and fragile in this story, as if it still whispers from that dark night where the hum of aircraft echoed, and that whisper reminds us that sometimes the greatest victories are born not from loud words but from the work of people whose names remain unknown, yet whose actions preserved entire cities. The fake Moscow became more than a military trick. It turned into a symbol of what a person is capable of when behind him stand home, family, the land he cannot surrender. This story shows that war is not only fire and steel, not only attacks and orders, sometimes it is art, subtle and almost ghost-like, when victory is born from the ability to see what cannot be seen with an ordinary eye. Those who created the Phantom City knew that their work might never be called great, that their names would not be spoken from grandstands, that their labor would remain hidden behind locked archives. But they continued because they knew they were saving not monuments and buildings, but the very breath of the capital, its rhythm, its future. Imagine the next sunrise after the night when the bombs fell into emptiness. The real Moscow awakens. People walk the streets, shops open, a conductor's footsteps sound in a tram. A child laughs somewhere by a window. None of them knows that their life could have ended, that they could have awakened beneath ruins, that instead of morning light there could have been ash and silence. And somewhere far away stand the people who served the light and shadow through the night, warming their hands over a pot of boiling water, silent, simply looking at one another, knowing that that night they managed to protect what mattered most. In this story, there are no loud fanfares, no ceremonial speeches. It speaks more quietly than other pages of war, but within it, one feels the pulse of extraordinary bravery. Because to play with the enemy's perception, to make him believe in a city that did not exist, to guide his gaze, to direct his fury to a place where there were no victims, is an act that holds cunning, art, and wisdom. Perhaps that is why the Phantom Moscow became known only decades later, when archives began to open, when people no longer feared to speak, when memory began to return forgotten voices. And when we look at this story today, we understand that it has lost nothing, neither its strength nor its meaning nor its wonder. It reminds us that a person is capable not only of destruction, but of protection, not only of creating weapons, but of creating illusions that save lives. And perhaps if one listens closely, Somewhere in the night, one can still hear the faint echo of those lights that burned on empty ground, lights that were nothing and at the same time everything, that became a shield for the city that had to endure.